These kinds of federal offenses, if they're not discharged, would probably make it impossible for him to go to the G7 meeting in Montreal in Canada because we won't let him in.
Trump, he's turned to the Supreme Court after a request to pause his upcoming criminal sentencing, as well as the consideration of his guilty verdict of 34 felony counts for falsifying business records, which was thrown out by the New York Court of Appeal. It's unclear how the Supreme Court is going to respond. Do you think that this sentencing will go ahead tomorrow?
Well, I don't know whether it will or not. This is a continuous litigation warfare that's gone on. And by the way, it goes on all over the US about everything. The Americans are the most over-lawyered society on the planet, probably because they do complicated business deals. They have 50 different states. Each state has a state Supreme Court, and it's just a morass of litigation all the time. This is part of another one of his ongoing attempts to get complete immunity because he is president or was president. And, what he's trying to do actually is defeat the rule of law for him. And that's why it keeps winding back. He has many different court cases because he's been charged with lots of things. Some of it may just be harassment from the other side. I don't know if we'll ever know. I have to assume if he's acquitted or convicted, those things are valid, but he doesn't, he fights everything. So the name of the game down there is to jurisdiction shop. You move from state to state, you take the same charges against you that applied in several states, you wage lawsuits in every state, and then you end up at the US Supreme Court, where he's appointed a lot of the justices that are there, which is very corrupt in itself.
What do you expect his sentence to be if it does go ahead tomorrow?
Well, the judges said there will be no sentence and there will be no probation. Basically, the judge is saying that in light of the fact he's about to become the president of the United States and is undertaking a pretty serious, difficult job, he's not going to, sentence him to any punishment. In fact, I would argue that sitting through that trial with hookers and all kinds of people saying things that they said about him is probably punishment enough for a man that high profile. I mean, my goodness, he was shamed nationally and internationally. But the judge has made it very clear he's not going to do any of that. And he's not going to discharge it all, which is what Trump wants. He wants it eradicated. It should never have happened and all of that. But a jury did sit, a judge sat, a verdict was reached of guilty on many counts, and the judge is going to keep that on the record. And he's going to fight that. And that's what he's fighting.
According to Forbes, they say that, the potential maximum penalty for what he's done, it could have been up to 717 years in prison and around $11.2 million in fines is what he potentially could receive for the charges that he was found guilty for. But as you mentioned, there's this ongoing case about presidential immunity. What does that say about presidential immunity? Should it still be something considered in America?
Well, I think I think it is appropriate when they're actually in office. And the reason I say that is that you cannot use the same legal measuring stick against the leader of a nation who is paid and elected to operate in the best interests of the people. Good example. Churchill knew from intelligence that Coventry was going to be bombed by the Germans. His decision was horrible. He had to decide whether to alert everybody in Coventry and avoid thousands of deaths, which would have tipped off the Germans that their intelligence had been penetrated, which would make other problems for the war, or say nothing. He said nothing. Now, that would be mass murder in a court case, but it was done within an office where the responsibility was to look after the greater good. And he made that judgment. Horrible to have to have made that. But the same thing could be applied when Trump is sitting there and he's deciding whether or not to assassinate Putin or the Ayatollah in Iran. Those are murders, premeditated murders. But he he can do that in the office. So it doesn't mean he can go around and shoot somebody on the street just for fun. It's a very tricky area of the law, but he would have it, Trump would have it, that he is completely immune, always has been. Therefore, the dozens of litigations that have been waged against him while he's out of office would be wiped away and he could sue for mega damages.
And there was an argument that potentially this sentencing should have come after his time in office. And obviously, Trump, he has denied any wrongdoing, but we do have this guilty verdict. How do you see this sentencing having an impact on Trump's second presidency?
I think it rolls off Americans' backs. Uh, he's not going to be sentenced. The judge said he's not going to go to the slammer. He's not even going to be put on probation, but he will have a stain on his record. He will have the record. The record will stand. He wants that eradicated. I'm not sure I want that eradicated. But the Supreme Court may decide that in the spirit of giving immunity to a president, he can do that. But, paying money to keep a hooker from saying anything to the press is not exercising judgment for the greater good of the public that elected him. So, frankly, I understand that the judge isn't going to drag him into jail. I mean, it's like horrific and all of that. It's embarrassing to the country. But he certainly shouldn't have that record wiped completely clean. Now, he's also arguing in the court, which is quite interesting, that even though these are not horrible war crimes or anything like that he's been convicted of in the past, these kinds of federal offenses, if they're not discharged, would probably make it impossible for him to go to the G7 meeting in Montreal in Canada because we won't let him in. And that's already happened. George Bush had a drunk, disorderly driving offense, George W. Bush, and he could not come into Canada, or maybe most countries, because we don't let people who are convicted felons or with drinking and driving charges enter our country if we know about them. So that would be very embarrassing.
And how do you think this will impact Trump's reputation with the international community, if at all?
Well, Trump's walking around these days talking about annexing Greenland and Panama Canal in Canada. So you tell me what you think his international reputation is. He's a cowboy gunslinger and he's got a big mouth. And, he's just not respected for that. He's respected for a lot of things. First of all, the office you have to respect. The United States, you have to respect his motivations because these are not about money. These are about, he thinks making America great again, making the world safer. But, he hasn't got a great reputation.
Looking forward to Trump's presidency, he's come out with a lot of claims about what he's potentially going to do, potentially going to end the Ukraine war within a day, as he's saying. He might take over Greenland, change the name of Mexico. We're hearing a lot of things coming from him. But, is this all talk, not going to be able to walk the walk? What do you think?
Well, it is all talk, but he can walk the walk. This guy is the most powerful man in the world right now. Fortunately, there are guardrails. And the guardrails are the fact that he's got to go to court all the time to not be able to do just exactly what he wants. His recent, I've got a Substack out today, and that is about Trump's New World Order. And I talk about what he's blabbing on about with Panama and Greenland and Canada. I live in Canada. I'm an American citizen. I mean, it's all nonsense. There's really no way that he can bully or scare Canadians into rushing headlong into a marriage with the Americans, especially since they have such a horrible healthcare system, exorbitant crime rates, a southern border that's out of control, and gun laws that create mass murder opportunities. I mean, that's just not a society that Canada wants to be. I mean, a lot of Canadians live there and work there, but that's by choice. This is not a country that you just threaten annexation to either, and it gets people's backs up. Now, Canadians are very polite, so they're not like Trump, but basically they're saying, well, that's interesting, but let's just be friends.
And in terms of relations with Europe in general, we've had Elon Musk, for example, he's had a lot of involvement on X about the Labour government, for example. And then, we're hearing from France and Germany saying that they would defend Greenland from the US. How do you see relations going from there with Trump and his administration?
Well, he's not in the top of the pops in Europe either. I mean, this is a guy who has been badgering the NATO members, who are Europeans, with the exception of Canada and including Canada, badgering them to spend 2% on military, and they haven't. Now they're starting to. Gee whiz! Guess why? Russia's invaded Ukraine, and it's on its way to Poland. So they're getting their act together there. And then on top of that, he's threatened the EU members, many of whom are the same as the NATO members, but not all, with 10 to 20% tariffs across the border on all their imports into the United States. Well, that's a pretty ruinous strategy. And he's threatened Canada with 25% tariffs and China with 100% tariffs. He wants to tariff everybody. Now, what he's done is, and that's of course enraged everybody, and all those things are very disruptive economically, and that's exactly the reason he does them. These are weapons in his economic war to make America richer and to clean up some of America's own situations. America is spending too much on military for other people, and they should be paid for it, or they shouldn't have to do it. And so that's the NATO argument. And on the tariff argument, America now is up to $1 trillion a year in a trade deficit with its trading partners. That's not sustainable. So they have to get their trading partners to buy a lot more American stuff than they are.
Do you see that happening with NATO partners? I mean, in the UK, for example, there's no talks about raising NATO spending to around 5%. But do you think that Trump's influence could have that effect on NATO countries?
Well, he was badgering them about 2%, which most of them were not meeting, including Canada and Britain. And now they're getting there, or they're pledging. They're saying they're trying to get there. So it works. And they should, it's up to Europeans to protect Europe. America's been very generous and they've done enough. And they will continue to do more because Russia's a global threat. But, I've been badgering Canada because it's been a laggard on military. We have a military that's just been neglected. It's really shameful. And that opens up the way to somebody like Trump pushing and pulling and maybe saying, if you're not going to do it, we're going to take you over. We're going to make sure this happens. And so I don't disagree with what he's done on NATO at all. And I think it's a very good idea. And I think the Europeans are starting. Now, the 5% is that much worse for them to have to handle. But he's going to keep badgering on that. And you see, it's a negotiating technique in business. How much do you want for your house? Well, I want $100,000. Well, I think it's worth 50. Well, will you accept 50? No, I won't. What do you want? Okay, I'll accept 90. And then you go all back and forth, back and forth. That's what this is.
There's, this argument that potentially what's quite good about Trump is that sort of loose cannon nature. And when I've spoken to a lot of Republicans, what they like about Trump is they say he's not a politician, he's a businessman. And he's got that business attitude. It sounds as though it does work in his favor, especially internationally.
Well, he's plain spoken. That's very American anyway. He's very open and honest about what he wants and what he needs. He puts prices on things, which is not done in proper places, but he does it, and I love it. And he bargains, he negotiates. I thought when he came out with the tariff scare, and all of Europe and Britain were like, oh my God, that's horrible. Christine Lagarde, who's the head of the central bank in Europe and former finance minister of France, said, what are you getting all excited about? Now, she's a lawyer who worked for an international law firm out of Chicago. She's lived in the US. She knows how it works there. She said, this is bargaining. He's telling you what he wants, and you're going to come back with a counter bid. And she said, this isn't a crisis for Europe. He said 20% tariffs, not definitely. So we have to start to buy American weapons, and we have to buy American LNG, and we'll get that trade deficit down very rapidly. And then it'll be fair. So she just saw it for what it was. It's a negotiating technique.
On the other hand, looking from an international perspective, they might argue that it's a very America first approach it's what's best for America, but potentially, international cooperation, especially with NATO and those sort of organizations, international cooperation requires, you know, a give and take, should I say. Do you think that Trump has that in mind as well?
Well, I would say that the allies of the United States have done take and not much give, to be honest with you. I have in my Substack newsletter about Trump's world order, I have a chart of the military expenditures. I mean, almost half of all the money spent on military is spent by the Americans. It's not to conquer countries, it's guarding Greenland, it's guarding Canada, it's guarding the Western Hemisphere, it's guarding the Panama Canal, it's helping Israel, it's helping Ukraine. It's helping the EU. I mean, they're doing this because they know it's important for the security of the world, but they shouldn't be bearing all this cost. These are wealthy countries. Why do the Saudis need American, fleets guarding them from Iran? It's crazy. They're rich. They should be paying the whole amount of it. They should hire them. And same with the other areas. So that's kind of where he's coming from. The give and take is very important, but it's all give and no take, so far. And he's going to turn that around.